Today's episode is sponsored by Blinkist, the app that lets you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try Blinkist totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've put the link right below this video. So unless you've avoided news of all kinds for the last 4 or 5 days, you probably know that things in the United States have gotten extremely intense. On top of a global 100-year pandemic, coronavirus, where the United States has been one of the worst hit countries, thanks in part to our failed federal leadership, we have seen the tragedy of George Floyd being killed by police in Minnesota set off a string of extreme civil unrest. And this includes examples of just about everything you can imagine, both by protesters and by those who are pretending to be protesters, but actually have nefarious intentions, and by police as well. And meanwhile, we are completely lacking anything that would be called leadership from the Oval Office, with Donald Trump doing everything from calling for pro-Trump protesters to gather at the White House on Saturday night, which they didn't, all the way to tweeting about essentially release the hounds, talking about Secret Service's vicious dogs that would be unleashed on protesters who breached the fence at the White House, up to and including flying to Florida and taking credit for a SpaceX launch of a Falcon 9 rocket carrying 2 astronauts to the International Space Station, while retweeting videos of himself talking about all of it Saturday as protests raged and buildings burned. And I really spent a lot of time this weekend thinking about what's the primary story here? What's like the main analysis that has to be done? What's the lens through which we need to understand what's happening in our country right now? Because I wanted to come to you and give you that point of view. Here's really what this is about. And the conclusion I came to is that there is no one lens. Things are more complicated than this is really what's going on. And I know that there are a ton of hot takes about this. If you look at Twitter lately, if you look at cable news, everybody claims to hold the real key. They claim to say this is the true filter through which this should all be seen. I'm here to tell you I don't have such a lens for you, because I believe any such lens is too simplistic. Now, if you want that simplistic analysis, there are plenty available. There's no question about it. But to some degree, we sometimes are blinded by narrative. And in some cases, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Meaning, if you want to see every issue as being related to one problem, you're able to find a way to do that, even if it's not really the right or most robust analysis. So I'm going to give you some examples, and then we'll get to what I think is a reasonable analysis and way to think about all of this. So one storyline we're hearing, and we've heard it from a lot of different people, is this is merely about race. This is about white cops killing black people. This is about white cops oppressing black protesters. This is about a fundamentally racist justice system. It's about a fundamentally racist society. That's what the lens is. Now, of course, race is a massive component that is causing understandable rage among a lot of people. But that analysis doesn't tell you everything that you need to know. Our economic system, at its core, for example, functions to stymie and suppress real change and activism. And it goes way beyond race, has racial implications, of course, but you miss that if you make this only about race. Much of that economic system is certainly rooted in supremacies along racial lines, but a race-only analysis falls short. A lot of the hot takes we're seeing are only about race. Another perspective that is heavily represented is that this is really about capitalism, right? Any capitalist system is inevitably racist and inevitably leads to this degree of social unrest: arson, looting, property damage, police violence against protesters, protester violence against police, protester on protester violence, protesters versus looters. That the idea is that is because of a capitalist system. Making this simply about capitalism, ignores the countless social democracies, right? Which that's a form of capitalism, it's regulated capitalism, that are some of the places where these issues of inequality and racial tensions have been best dealt with around the world. Some of the best examples, in fact, of functioning societies with reduced income inequality, reduced racial inequality, social safety nets, trust in institutions, less corruption. They are regulated versions of capitalism. So I believe that the capitalism analysis also fails. Another lens that's being presented as the lens is simply about police brutality, meaning this is about police brutality as what killed George Floyd. This is about police brutality as the problem in the protests. In other words, if it weren't for police brutality, George Floyd would be alive. If George Floyd were alive, we wouldn't be seeing these protests. We at the protests are also just seeing further police brutality. Now, there is no shortage of police brutality at the protests. What happened to George Floyd is unconscionable. But this is about so much more than that, including economic and racial issues. It's about the militarization of law enforcement in the United States. And there are people making it only about that. It's not only about that, but that's a part of it. When you militarize law enforcement, you create overly aggressive policing. You can argue that that played a role in George Floyd's death. Militarization is what led police in riot gear in dozens of cities over the weekend to use tear gas and rubber bullets and to see media and random bystanders and even people peacefully protesting, which is, of course, their right to do, horribly injured by police. So militarization of law enforcement is another huge problem in the U.S. We've covered it, but it is not the only lens that we need to be using. So here's the reality when you think about this, and we often want things to be black and white. We want to say this is what this is really about. The reality is this is a country of 331 million people. We have examples of everything you can imagine. We have dozens of different problems that relate to what we are now seeing. Just this weekend, we saw sickening violence done by police to protesters, including, for example, an elderly man with a cane shoved onto the ground by police. And we saw police, and I believe it was Michigan, show up and tell the protesters, I'm putting down my weapons. I'm with you. Let's march together. We saw protesters burn entire buildings and brutalize business owners, including middle-aged women. And yet we also saw protesters guard a police officer who was separated from his squad on Saturday night. And this is the risk about the out-of-context sharing of pictures and video on social media, 10 seconds from one protest and 15 from another. And I actually did some of this over the weekend, and I don't know that it was the best thing. Not only does it lack immediate context, it lacks broader context about all of the issues that have gotten us to where we are now, including, by the way, a complete lack of leadership from the president. And we're going to talk about that later, which is why I'm not digging into it too much right here. So my message is what we are seeing is mostly about systems, and it is less about individuals. You're seeing a ton of debates about what portion of police are good versus bad, which is very fraught terminology anyway, good and bad. What portion of protesters have good or bad intentions? What portion of protesters are grassroots members of the community versus out-of-town astroturfers, as has been a growing narrative over the weekend, used in part to discredit the real and justified anger that protesters have about what's going on in their communities. The problem is, if you just argue about that, if you spend your time on those questions, well, 82% of the protesters are good, or whatever you might say. You're not really digging into the systemic elements at play. If we figure out it's 85% of the protesters that are good instead of 80, then what? It's good fodder for corporate media. It does little for anybody else. So I don't pretend to have one single unifying theory about this. This is what it's really about, and at the exclusion of other things. That's not something you're going to hear from me. But what I can tell you for sure is that you won't understand any of this if you don't understand the context. And that's where a lot of the local news coverage of the protests has failed, which is a complete lack of context. Oh, somebody looted a cheesecake factory and they came out with the cheesecake. That's coverage that we saw. Doesn't really tell us anything about what's going on. So racialized policing combined with a two-tier justice system for rich and poor, a system that focuses on street crime at the exclusion of white-collar crime, combined with an economic system that doesn't work for a huge portion of the country, in addition to right now having nearly 25% unofficial unemployment in the midst of a 100-year pandemic, in addition to a complete absence of federal leadership from a president who tweeted all weekend from his bunker at the White House, combined with corporate media that really is seeking to foment division rather than find solutions, it's not a good recipe. And then you add to that militarized law enforcement that seems to always have money, despite we supposedly lacking our supposed lack of money for healthcare and education. It's all of that stuff together. Now, I want to be really clear. This is not like a social justice intersectionality analysis of race and gender and it's not that. What it is an understanding that we have systems in our country that are bigger than any one protest or any one police officer. And only with that multi-focus perspective can you really get anything that we would call an all-encompassing analysis. Let me give you another example of a false debate. Riots are good versus riots are bad, or riots are effective versus the riots are ineffective, or they are criminal or they are heroic. First of all, a ton of this debate is actually semantic in terms of some people are arguing over whether riots are good or bad. Others are arguing over what counts as a riot versus a protest. There's racialization of the language. There's a lack of context, etc. But what you really have to understand is you can simultaneously say, I'm against violence, both against people and property. I believe it is unlikely that the violence will achieve much. And yet, at the same time, I understand that people have had it and I get what's going on, right? Someone's son is killed by police and then a window gets smashed. It's hard to feel like these things are equivalent in any way without needing to endorse property damage. We can understand that people have absolutely had it. People are sick and tired of the status quo. And while I might not think we will achieve change by breaking windows, I understand and sympathize with the absolute anger and disgust with these systems that protesters have. Now, I have to tell you, the argument that the unrest has accomplished nothing, I don't know if it's a good argument. You all know that I have always said I favor legal protests. I'm against violence, including against most forms of property crime. Over the weekend, we saw the officer who killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, arrested. We saw Fox News Sunday devote an hour to the protests, to George Floyd, and to how coronavirus disproportionately affects communities of color with guest Cornel West. I don't know that were it not for the national unrest, we would have seen that be the Fox News Sunday show. I don't know. I think that what we're seeing played a role in what Fox News even decided to do on Sunday. Would we have seen Derek Chauvin get arrested? Would we potentially be seeing the other three officers get arrested were it not for this degree of unrest? I don't know is the question. It's less clear to me that this has accomplished nothing. And that is separate from whether these are tactics that I condone. Last thing, and I want to be really clear here. This is not like some kumbaya segment where everyone's thoughts are equally valid and everyone is equally responsible for what's going on. That's not what this is. But what we need to understand is that the word privilege is often thrown around. You're privileged if you say cops are mostly good and protect you, because a lot of people live in places where the cops aren't primarily there to protect you, or at least it certainly doesn't feel that way if you're part of certain communities. Or you're privileged to be against property crime during protests because you live somewhere safe and the systems work for you and you can't possibly imagine what it's like to actually be in the position that a lot of the protesters are in. In some way, all of those allegations are correct, and yet this is not so much about individual privilege. It's, again, systems that aren't working for large swaths of people. And that gets me to my last thought. In history, we've seen unrest lead to movements which lead to activism, which will often enter the political and legal space, which at some point will end up being decided by a judge somewhere. Look at Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark decision that said states can't segregate schools by race. That was in 1954. It started in 1951 in Kansas. It involved 3 years of activism, protests, consensus building, and eventually it was a Supreme Court decision under Earl Warren that decided 9-0 on the court, schools can't racially segregate. As we figure out what needs to happen next, do not miss the forest for the trees that may come 1, 2, or 3 years down the line. If what is going on now will lead to change, it may come down to who is on the Supreme Court in 1, 2, or 3 years. I don't even have to tell you what that means about a decision we all have to make 5 months from now, because you all know exactly what that decision is. So 2 weeks ago, I did a story asking, is the United States a failed state? We failed on a medical response to the pandemic, health systems falling apart, corruption, no trust in government. Are we a failed state? We are now finding ourselves asking, is the U.S. a first world country in light of the completely absent leadership as from federal government as protests rage nationally over out of control policing, as it is seen by millions and millions of people? And in addition to the protests, literal dumpster fires around the White House as the White House sits in darkness with Trump tweeting, as you have violence, police attacking protesters, protesters attacking police. We're seeing media get shot with rubber bullets and attacked not just physically, but ideologically for their presence at the unrest. Caitlin Rust, a reporter for an NBC affiliate station in Louisville, Kentucky, was fired upon by police Friday night covering a live street protest that was going on. CNN reporter Omar Jimenez was arrested while covering protests over the weekend, subsequently released. It was chalked up to confusion by police about who he was. He happens to be black. Last night, Cleveland police said no media would be allowed in any of the downtown area as protests raged. It's not even clear that that's legal to do. This concept of a first world country comes from the Cold War. It has some implicit biases, but really now what we're talking about is the westernized, developed nations of the world. So look at what we have: corrupt, incompetent leadership, increasing attacks on media by government and by police, growing unrest between police and the public, a judiciary system that has 2 tiers, one for the rich and one for the poor. We've got rampant cronyism and corruption, lack of access to quality health care for a huge portion of the country, a failing education system. Our response to the coronavirus pandemic has completely failed compared to other developed nations. Infrastructure is not crumbling, but we are way behind where we should be for a country of our wealth. Look at our airports to some around the world. Look at our highways to those in many parts of the world. And meanwhile, our president is sitting in a darkened White House, sometimes in the bunker below it on Friday night, as D.C. literally burns, providing no leadership, no words of de-escalation, nothing other than self-aggrandizement and threats to protesters. So I'm not literally saying we are no longer a first world country, but more and more we're reacting to events the way a less advanced country would. I want to hear from you about this. I will have more about it upcoming. Let me know your thoughts on Twitter @dpacman. Remember to make sure you are subscribed for free to the daily 1 hour long David Pakman Show podcast on whatever podcasting app you use.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
What if you could read 10 books in just one sitting? That's exactly what one of my favorite apps lets you do. It's called Blinkist, and what they do is take thousands of popular nonfiction books. They condense them down into text or audio that you can consume in 15 minutes. Blinkist makes sure that you're getting all of the important core insights from each book. So it's perfect for exploring a book you otherwise wouldn't have time for. If there's a full book you're thinking about buying, you can use Blinkist to get a sample first. Just think how much you can enrich yourself by being able to soak up an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. I recently read A Brief History of Time, of course, by the great Stephen Hawking. This is a book that I have been aware of for so long, and other things got in the way, and it was fantastic to check it out on Blinkist. Blinkist has books on politics, philosophy, science. They have 27 different nonfiction categories, and a subscription is only about $8 a month. and you get the entire library. But you can try it totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've put the link right underneath this video.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Tom Cunningham and Chad Sampson. Thanks so much to both of you guys. Also want to say thanks to Kelly Good. Kelly is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. She's been a member for almost 5 years. Grab a membership, get all the great membership benefits, including the daily bonus show, by signing up at joinpakman.com. There are images of police using violence against peaceful protesters. There are images of police creating confrontations, even attacking defenseless elderly people. We played a video of police knocking over an elderly man with a cane, shooting at the media. These images have gone viral over the weekend. Now, I want to be really clear. I already did a story about how what's going on in America right now is not just about one thing. It's not just about race. It's not only about police. It's not exclusively about capitalism or Trump. This is a massive, multifaceted ordeal. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at individual elements. And one of these elements is the idea of police as oppressors versus police as victims, as some have started framing police to be. We are seeing wholesale pepper spraying of peaceful protesters. We've seen members of the media shot with rubber bullets. We saw kids hit with pepper spray. We've seen police ramming police vehicles into crowds. A Dallas woman was hit in the face with a rubber bullet while walking home with her groceries. Police wildly hitting people with batons, in some cases, people walking away from protests. None of this excuses any violent actions by protesters, and there have been horrible actions, including attacking business owners, beating one business owner to within an inch of his life for trying to defend his business, beating a female business owner brutally out in front of her store. We have seen it all. But I want to focus in a little bit here on the police component and talk about it with you. There are people, and I'm friends with some of them on Facebook, I'm seeing it on Twitter. There are people who have immediately taken to painting police as victims. Arguments like, a bad cop may have killed George Floyd in Minnesota, but now innocent police all over the place are being attacked for no reason. And often these arguments end up in debates about numbers, like, well, most police are good. Is it 97% or 99%? Well, is it 99 or 99.3%? And I said earlier in the show, imagine we figured out with some precision what portion of police are the problem, as we might call it, and what portion of police are not. Imagine 99.2% of police are good. Okay, well, I imagine that most of my audience, even if you're okay with property crime and protest, where insurance companies are the ones taking a hit and corporations, I imagine most of my audience is not okay with unprovoked attacks against random police officers who aren't doing anything wrong. If you do believe that for what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota, it's okay to just physically attack an officer in Miami, we're just not on the same page. I think that's the minority of my audience. Does our analysis depend, though, on whether it's 99.2 or 99.3% of police that are good guys in it for the right reasons? Because what really this is about is context and power dynamics. In total, once you concede that most cops are good and doing their job as best they can, often in difficult situations, sometimes dangerous situations, you also have some cops that go into law enforcement specifically because they would love an opportunity to beat the crap out of someone, just like some portion of people go into the military because they like the idea of shooting someone and killing them in some kind of theater of war at some point. That is some percentage. Okay, so then what, right? Whether it's 0.8 or 0.7 or 0.08% of police that are going in because they want to do violence and misbehave and have all the worst intentions, what next? And that's where the more difficult conversations start. Questions like, are the good cops who are just doing their job part of the problem? In that, if you're not part of the solution, are you implicitly supporting the status quo? of that small percentage of police that do horrible things and get away with it? To what degree? Should every, quote, good cop quit in protest to show solidarity with the protests, leaving our country to be policed only by the bad cops? What counts as a sign of being complicit? Is silence a sign of being complicit? What power and responsibility do individual police officers have to fix the problem versus police chiefs, versus federal law enforcement agencies, versus police unions that represent officers around the country? Should the good cops be treated respectfully or suspiciously, absent any reason to believe they are one of the bad cops? How should they be treated by protesters, the average person, etc.? When you start asking these questions, you realize that most of the changes that need to be made are systemic changes. It needs to be much more likely that if you do the wrong thing as a police officer, you will be caught and punished. It's not likely right now in a lot of our society. Just from this weekend, we have dozens, if not hundreds of officers on video doing horrible things. Are we confident they're going to be identified and investigated and charged and punished when it's appropriate? Not really, because if it were more likely that they were held accountable, they would probably change their behavior. That is a systemic issue. A good system will take care of that sliver of police that are doing sick, horrible things. So let's answer the questions one by one. First of all, being a police officer is not like being an accountant, okay? Accountants don't represent communities in the way that police officers do. Accountants don't wield their power with firearms, and accountants don't have a power dynamic relative to their clients the way police officers have a power dynamic relative to the people that they are dealing with. So on the one hand, the good police officers must say much more loudly, these things are not okay, and we're committed to fixing it and changing it. And good for them, many police officers have done exactly that. At the same time, the anger by protesters towards a system of policing that is fundamentally broken in many parts of our country is justified anger. And this is why it's so powerful when police officers get it and say, I'm with you, like the sheriff in Michigan who marched with protesters and the video going viral. And it's important for protesters to know that their anger with the system is justified, and yet it's not okay to go attack random individual cops who have not done anything wrong, which is why it was great to see protesters protecting a police officer Saturday night who had done nothing wrong and was separated from his squad. This is why it was great to see video from, I believe it was Brooklyn last night, with organizers saying, do not interact with the police. We are not here for that. We are here to get our message out. Do not incite violence. If you see anyone inciting violence, call them out. And, you know, in the midst of this, there's this really ugly thing that's going on where there are people sort of making the focus that the protesters are from out of town. And at one point, there was some wrong report that more than half of protesters in some place were from out of town. Another report, it said, it seemed like 1 out of 7 were from out of town. Now, sometimes that could mean the next town over. It's not really a big deal. But the point is, this out of town narrative is being used to imply that you merely have people from other communities who are not coming in to protest because they actually are concerned about police brutality in relations or whatever, but that they are coming in to provoke or to loot or to steal. You could be concerned about what went on and drive from another state. And it also appears to be completely untrue. So we've got to be really understanding of how some of these narratives are being used to distort and discredit real justifiable anger. We also have to recognize the growing number of protests that are saying, we are not here to do violence at all, and we are not here to do violence to the police, but we have to realize that the anger is justified given the systemic dynamics that exist. That's sort of my sense of it right now. I'm glad to hear from you about it as well. Okay, so now let's go from talking about police to talking about destruction of property. There are reasonable people who have centered in on what seems to be a dividing line as we see unrest and protests and physical violence and property damage around the country. When we talk about property damage, there is often a debate as to whether it counts as violence in the sense of when people say, I am against violence. So most people agree attacking random bystanders who aren't being violent is unacceptable violence. Attacking random police who aren't doing anything wrong, that is violence in any sense of the word. Most people agree blocking traffic is not violence. Now, you could be for or against blocking traffic as a protest tactic, but most people would not say blocking traffic is violence. You could maybe say, well, if you prevent people from getting to work and then they lose their jobs, blocking traffic becomes kind of like economic violence. But in the kind of violence we're talking about, blocking traffic, most people agree is not violence. What about property damage? So first of all, we have to call out the right-wing hypocrites on this issue, the concern trolls who a month ago were saying sacrifice grandma to coronavirus in order to open the economy, who are now saying the worst thing you can do is break the windows of a big box store. They are hypocrites. I'm not interested in those hypocritical concern trolls. I want to deal with the real people, with the sensible people who in a real way want to talk about this. There are folks who believe that, for example, destroying government property when no one gets physically hurt is okay. But, for example, destroying a private business is not okay. That depends on who you're targeting. You could be targeting a business with bad practices, or you could be targeting a government that is a bad actor or whatever. You could find, a logging company and say, we are going to destroy or disable their bulldozers so that they cannot take down these trees. Saying what determines whether destruction of property is violence is merely whether you're doing it to a government property or to private property. I don't think that's really the dividing line. What this comes down to is, what do we mean by violence? Violence defined as behavior involving physical force to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Damaging property sort of fits. If you want to take a legal perspective, certainly the unlawful exercise of force or the exhibition of such force would encompass the destruction of property. Now, others would say the real crux of human violence versus physical violence against people rather than objects is where we should be focusing. If you are talking about breaking a window, that's not really what a lot of people believe is violence. So here's the bottom line. If you want to make this a semantic argument, if you want to make this about definitions, you can define violence in a way that does or doesn't include property crime. It won't really get to the underlying issue. And the underlying issue is whether sometimes violence is justified. So even if we agree on whether property crime is or is not violence, that doesn't answer the question of whether property crime, destruction of property, is a valid form of protest. Who gets to decide what's in the protesting playbook? If you leave the protesting playbook only to the elites and those in positions of power, it will be restricted to only writing letters, chanting and holding signs, right? The point is, if you let those already in power define what is okay in terms of protesting, certainly nothing will ever change. Now, is there any guarantee that destroying property is going to achieve change? There's not. We do know that destruction of property has been a part of protesting for a really long time. You look at the Boston Tea Party, destroyed property to fight back against the capitalist monopoly and political rights that were being claimed by British colonists. You look at slave uprisings in the United States, which included destruction of property. You look at the Plowshares 8, a group of 8 Christians, including priests and nuns, who took hammers to the nose cones of some nuclear warheads, poured their blood on the facility's papers in a call for peace. So the legality part of it is clear. This stuff is illegal to do. But I think we can all, every single one of us, imagine a situation where we do the moderate methods and they bring no change. They don't get attention. And then you say, well, we don't want to do violence to people, but we're going to start destroying some property. Destruction of property, in my mind, is clearly violence of a kind, but in certain situations, it might be the only thing people have left short of starting to actually do violence to individuals. Now, which situations count? I don't know. What about the consequences? Well, there are consequences. You're not going to get around that. Will property damage get you what you want? Often it will not. Property damage may, in fact, do the opposite. It may turn public opinion against you. But whether property damage that's not hurting anyone physically is a valid form of protest, that's a question that goes back at least hundreds of years. And anybody pretending that there is one single solitary answer that applies to every situation is just wrong. History tells us that's not the case. I want to hear from you about this. We're going to continue covering it on the David Pakman Show Instagram, at David Pakman Show. We will take a break and be back with much more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. Vote soon 18.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We are currently in a crisis of leadership so severe in the United States that Donald Trump spent his weekend retweeting videos of himself and threatening protesters with vicious dogs and violence from Secret Service agents rather than leading, uniting, doing something productive, because he doesn't know how to do those things. And according to one White House report, the reason we've not heard from Donald Trump, something from the Oval Office, a message of unity, is that Trump has nothing to say. So rather, he's staying quiet, except not really, because he's tweeting uncontrollably. The U.S. is devolving into chaos. Trump spent the weekend retweeting videos of himself trying to take credit for the SpaceX launch, threatening protesters with vicious dogs, claiming he'll designate Antifa a terrorist organization. He has no idea what to do. It is a complete lack of leadership. We fortunately heard from former President Barack Obama with something that could be approximating leadership. We're going to look at a couple of items here, starting with Donald Trump's threats to unleash vicious dogs on protesters. He might as well have said, we're going to get the fire hoses out as well. There have been varying levels of unrest around the country stemming from the police killing of George Floyd. This includes people near the White House. Trump tweeted on Saturday about protesters near the White House. Check this out, this incredibly ludicrous rant. Trump saying, quote, "Great job last night at the White House by the U.S. Secret Service. They were not only totally professional, but very cool. I was inside, watched every move, and couldn't have felt more safe. And they let the protesters scream and rant as much as they wanted. But whenever someone got too frisky or out of line, they would quickly come down on them hard. Didn't know what hit them. The front line was replaced with fresh agents like magic, big crowd, professionally organized, but nobody came close to breaching the fence. If they had, they would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs and ominous weapons I have ever seen. That's when people would have been really badly hurt, at least. Many Secret Service agents just waiting for action. We put the young ones on the front line, sir, and they love it." He might as well be saying, Secret Service is thirsty for blood, and we're bringing out the fire hoses. Release the hounds is what he is essentially saying here. Now, this point about, vicious dogs and ominous weapons, that's bad enough. The idea that young Secret Service agents are just waiting for action, that's Trump claiming. I'm guessing the Secret Service would not even agree with Trump's characterization. This is Trump claiming that Secret Service is looking to beat the crap out of people. That's the opposite of leadership. That's the opposite of bringing calm to a nation that is dealing with essentially the Spanish flu at the same time as some of the worst civil unrest that we have seen, in addition to a complete lack of federal leadership, all combined at the same time with a recession/depression going on. It's all happening at once. And Trump is doing nothing to actually bring people together. A real leader would ask for calm. A real leader would go to the Oval Office and address the nation saying, we are a nation in struggle. I hear you. I hear your concerns and your complaints. I'm committed to working together to improve the country. Let's stop the violence. Let's stop the attack, stop the violence by police. Let's realize that we are one nation currently fighting a pandemic and a recession depression. No one benefits from adding this chaos to the pandemic. I'm here with you on the inequality in our justice system. I'm here with you on policing. Give me the space and the calm I need to work on this. Instead, he tweets threats about vicious dogs, retweets himself taking credit for the rocket launch over the weekend that has nothing to do with him, says, hey, Antifa, you're now a terrorist organization, which I will get to next. This is incompetence combined with authoritarianism from a wannabe dictator, Donald Trump. Don't for a second think that Donald Trump, by the way, is not deep down planning to use these protests to further disrupt the 2020 election for his benefit. Unrest in major cities, things are way too crazy for vote by mail. Ballots will be stolen or something. We absolutely can't do it. Trump has the power of the bully pulpit. At any point, he could say, I'm going to use that for good. He could do it now in so many ways. The country is plagued by challenges, the pandemic, financial crisis, oppression, discrimination coming to a head. And we have nothing from Trump. He also tweeted, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. That's a quote from violent, racist Miami police chief, I forget his name, years ago. A tweet so hideous, it was flagged by Twitter as glorifying violence. A real leader would dial down the anger and the heat. Trump doesn't know how to do that. So he's antagonizing protesters. He's riling up his own base. He's firing up the gun people. And he's not even pretending to represent all Americans here. Trump opens his mouth and trash falls out. That shouldn't surprise us anymore. I hope people are realizing the urgent nature of removing this president. And we've got to keep our eye on the ball because the distractions keep coming. And that's what I want to talk about next. We cannot be distracted by Donald Trump's antics from the real crises and real responsibilities and duties that we have. The virus, police killings, protests devolving into chaos and violence. Removing Trump must be done. But Trump is very aggressively trying to distract us. I already told you some of the ways earlier. And the latest is Trump tweeting that he will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. Donald Trump, of course, announcing this on Twitter, saying, quote, the United States of America will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. So there's a few different things to talk about here. Antifa is a militant left-wing movement that stands for anti-fascism, Antifa, okay? That's where the name comes from. Antifa is not centrally organized. It's a sort of umbrella designation. Antifa I see as more of a strategy than a group of people per se. And sometimes they do violent things that I vehemently oppose. I have been endlessly critical of many of the tactics employed by individuals organizing under the umbrella of Antifa. It appears, though, that what Donald Trump is trying to do here is not actually constitutional in designating them a terrorist organization. The United States State Department has a list of terrorist organizations. They are foreign. Antifa is not foreign. Antifa is a domestic group. Even more importantly, if Donald Trump were to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization, they would lose some First Amendment protections which apply only to foreign terrorist organizations. So understand that this is part of the framing by Trump and William Barr, that the recent protests and unrest are merely left-wing anarchists looking to do violence and sow chaos. Now, to be clear, there is no shortage of anarchists all over the political spectrum doing protesting, many with ulterior motives. But there is also plenty of right-wing astroturf. There is police escalation by way of haphazard pepper spraying, shooting at media, etc. And this entire story of this is not genuine anger and frustration with policing in America or whatever else. These are provocateurs coming in from outside. That is being used to single-handedly devalue the complaints and concerns that the protesters have, and we can't fall for that. But this claim from Donald Trump that he will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization, it's a political statement. It is not a law enforcement statement. It's really important to understand that. And it doesn't appear to be a legal statement either. Trump really cannot designate a domestic group a terrorist organization It would deny them their First Amendment rights. It would also deny them due process. And it is likely unconstitutional, and it's not something Trump is going to be able to do. He may not even really try, because understand, the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations, you just can't put Antifa on that list. But he said it on Twitter, and that's the whole point. That's the big picture here. This is another attempt to distract. We must keep our eyes on the ball. Trump has failed on coronavirus. More than 105,000 have died. 50 or 60% of those deaths could have been prevented by a 2-week earlier request from Trump for a 50-state stay-at-home order and actual testing capacity. On that note, I don't want to get you to something boring, but understand, Trump's tweeting about designating Antifa a terrorist organization. We still, after 4 months, aren't testing 500,000 people a day in the United States. We still, after 4 months, aren't at the absolute minimum testing we need to really look at reopening the country. We have national unrest with protests, violence, looting, destruction of property, arson. Trump's tweeting about Antifa and that the White House will release vicious dogs to go after protesters if they get past the fence. Oh, and by the way, the wall isn't being built. Trump didn't repeal and replace Obamacare with something better like he said he would. His trade war with China has failed. 25% of the workforce is out of jobs in the last 10 weeks. So, of course, Donald Trump is trying to take credit for SpaceX and make this about Antifa and otherwise pretend that he's doing a great job. It is an abject failure that we have not seen in the United States for a long time. I mean, you have to look at Bush's failure on 9/11 when he said, let's go into Iraq, even though they didn't have anything to do with the 9/11 attacks. And this is all meant to distract. It actually is starting to feel like it may not work. If you look at polling, cautious optimism that what Trump is doing to distract isn't working. Assume nothing. Every one of us has to vote in November.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So over the last 48 hours, we've had a stunning contrast between the man who is currently president of the United States and the man that wants to be president of the United States. And I'm talking, of course, of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump, as I've already told you to some degree, sat in the White House, at one point in the basement bunker. At another point, he went down to Florida to give a speech about Elon Musk's success with NASA in launching the Falcon 9 rocket with the Dragon spacecraft to bring 2 astronauts to the space station. And Donald Trump essentially spent the weekend tweeting, attacking the motives of protesters, threatening to release vicious dogs against protesters, and generally escalating tensions. Meanwhile, Joe Biden, who is 4 years Trump's senior, went out and, wearing a mask, talked to actual protesters about what's going on, why they are protesting, and all of these relevant issues in society today, took pictures with people while tweeting conciliatory and understanding things rather than threatening people with releasing the hounds, essentially. The contrast could not be more stark at this point. No national address from Trump meant to reduce tensions and bring people together. Instead, a weekend of tweets about vicious dogs and ominous weapons, and the Secret Service is going to go after people. Tweets talking about we're going to make Antifa a terrorist organization, and then Trump being rushed on Friday to the underground bunker used to protect presidents during terrorist attacks below the White House. Even China goading Trump. Foreign Ministry spokesman Li Zhenzhao urged the United States to eliminate racial discrimination and protect the lawful rights of minorities. Hu Zhijin, editor of the nationalist tabloid Global Times, telling Donald Trump, Mr. President, don't go hide behind the Secret Service. Now, that's Trump. Then you have Biden, who you don't have to like, you don't have to see as a progressive because he's not. Joe Biden went and met with protesters, tweeted conciliatory messages. You don't have to love Biden to understand the difference between these two men. You don't have to see Biden as a progressive because, as I said, he's not, to realize that the world is laughing at us and we would be better off if they stopped. And replacing Donald Trump with Biden is the option we have 5 months from now. And I will be doing everything I can to make sure that that replacement takes place. Trump tweeting about releasing the hounds on protesters. Joe Biden tweeting, quote, "We are a nation in pain right now, but we must not allow this pain to destroy us. As president, I will help lead this conversation. And more importantly, I will listen, just as I did today visiting the site of last night's protest in Wilmington." Biden publishing a 5-minute video discussing what we are seeing with police and George Floyd in some detail, adding, quote, "We are a country with an open wound. None of us can turn away. None of us can be silent. None of us any longer can hear those words, 'I can't breathe,' and do nothing. We must commit as a nation to pursue justice with every ounce of our being." And most importantly, maybe Joe Biden not hanging out in a bunker or in his basement in Delaware, but just going out and talking to protesters. We're showing some of that video now. So listen, am I saying Joe Biden is the be-all, end-all on criminal justice reform? Of course not. Joe Biden sponsored the 1994 crime bill that was so destructive. Bernie Sanders also voted for it, by the way. And there is no doubt that not enough was done during Barack Obama's administration, of which Biden was a part, on criminal justice. But this is comparing apples to bicycles. It's comparing apples to trash. When it comes to Biden and Trump and the leadership deficit that we're experiencing right now, it's a tragedy. And the optics of Trump tweeting from a White House bunker while Joe Biden is kneeling with protesters, this isn't good for Trump. It shouldn't be good for Trump. And Biden, of course, would not get everything right as president, but at least he would bring back something that looks and feels like leadership and like a man connected to what's happening in the country, rather than a guy who will literally sit in his basement tweeting agit trash as more and more violence is instigated by virtue of his every tweet. Speaking of a furious basement-dwelling Trump, this is fascinating and hilarious. Donald Trump has been completely embarrassed by world leaders, including the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who turned down Trump's invitation to come to the U.S. for the G7 summit at the White House. So understand the backstory. For a few weeks now, the White House has continued to talk about, we want to do the G7. We might do it at Camp David. We might do it at the White House. Coronavirus, no, I think we're going to be able to do it. It's going to be really, really great. And reporters smartly were asking, should you be doing this given the pandemic? But also, which world leaders have accepted your invitation so far? And they didn't say, but they just kept insisting. Trump did, and Kayleigh McEnany. World leaders are reacting very favorably. We're going to have news about this soon. Yada, yada, yada. Hopefully it'll happen at the end of June. Everything's going to be fine. We suspected this was BS. Most world leaders, clearly, from what they say, understand this is not the time to be traveling all over the world, possibly spreading coronavirus, to come and give Trump his photo op at the White House or Camp David. And one of the first to turn down the invitation over the weekend was German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who essentially said no thanks. She said, I'm not going. It's too early to reopen. We shouldn't be having large gatherings. The virus is very much circulating. And Trump reportedly furious at Angela Merkel. And then Trump does this thing that, you know, it's not surprising, but it's so pathetic. Trump decides to pretend it was really his decision not to do the G7, and that the countries that are currently in it aren't really the right ones, calls it an outdated group. And according to press pool reports, Donald Trump said, I'm postponing it because I don't feel as a G7, it probably represents what's going on in the world. It's a very outdated group. Trump mentioning that he wants to add Russia and some other countries to the group. So this is an obvious lie. Trump is postponing it because nobody's coming. They've turned down the invitation, at least Angela Merkel has. World leaders said no, and now Trump is pretending he didn't want it to happen with this group anyway. And the entire, adding Russia thing and the group being outdated. This is how Trump attacks people that don't want to say yes to him, quite simply. It's just everything is a childish temper tantrum. Now, just imagine what Trump will do if he loses in November. It will be like nothing we have seen before from any president. One other sort of interesting thing about the whole G7 fiasco, this is why diplomats exist. In a normal administration, you don't have Trump for a month saying, we're going to push for G7 and the leaders are reacting very positively, very strong positive reactions. In a normal situation, diplomats figure all of this out. You don't put Trump out there on a limb saying we're doing the G7 and we're doing it here, even though they're not actually yet scheduled to do it. Then you end up with world leaders saying no thanks, and Trump tries to save face by saying, well, I want better countries in it anyway. In a normal administration, diplomats handle this. There will be one statement about it, and it is either we have decided to postpone the G7 due to coronavirus fears, or we are confirmed having the G7 on such and such date. You avoid all of these embarrassing fiascos in the first place. This is all self-harm done by Donald Trump. And the degree to which he is being shunned by world leaders is really representative of just a slide down the totem pole, so to speak, for the U.S. presidency globally. It's embarrassing to Americans. It needs to change. And just imagine this is what Trump is doing over Angela Merkel saying no thanks. Just imagine what he will do if he is indeed defeated in November. We have a voicemail number. Good question in this voicemail. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. Voicemail caller says, hey, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, but is any more money coming for coronavirus? Because it's been 4 months and we got $1,200.
Hey, David. I was just really curious, especially with the end of the month coming up. We've only gotten one stimulus package or direct payment to the people.
Yep.
I was wondering if you offhand knew what percentage of this stimulus package, I mean, everything including going to the banks and all the cruise liners, all these different companies.
Yeah.
What percentage of all of that went directly to the people? Just how much of our tax money was dished out to companies compared to how much did we get our money?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, I believe that we had I thought it was $6 trillion total, and that $2 trillion was direct stimulus, and then a bunch went to specific big industries, and then a bunch was available to smaller and big businesses through PPP. I don't have those exact numbers. And then the bigger question is, this started in mid-March for a lot of people. We are now in June. For some people, this sort of started to ramp up in February. In places that took it really seriously earlier. Is $1,200 going to be it? Or is there going to be some more stimulus coming? The second quarter numbers, second quarter being April, May, June, we're now in the third of 3 months of the second quarter. If we don't start seeing recovery, there has to be more. Something more is going to have to be done. And you've got people like Ro Khanna with proposals. You have other members of Congress with proposals. Trump's not talking about it. This just doesn't work. $1,200 and unemployment only for people who completely lost their jobs. It's just not going to cut it. And one of the things we will be talking about on the bonus show today is that a lot of the eviction freezes are expiring now. It's June 1st. Some eviction freezes expire, and people aren't going to have money for the rent that's due today, June 1st. So we'll talk about that on the bonus show. We will also talk about much more. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpacman.com. It takes seconds. And remember to get our free daily podcast, the 1 hour podcast, on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. We are there. Grab that daily podcast. We love it. Thanks so much for watching today's full episode of the show. Just a reminder, today's sponsor is Blinkist, the app that lets you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try Blinkist for free and save 25% off of a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've also included the link right underneath this video.